Hello, everybody. I'm Sid Milkis from the Miller Center and the Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Miller Center's webinar on presidents, parties, social movements, and the 2020 election. We're going to focus particularly today on social movements and how they interact with political institutions. And that is clearly a very important and timely topic. On the right, we have a president who sees himself as the head of a movement. He embraces movements that have had a relationship with the Republican Party for a long time, such as the Christian right and the Tea Party. But more controversially, he has defended more recent uprisings, armed white militia wearing MAGA hats, who stormed Michigan's Capitol to protest Governor Gretchen Whitmer's measures to curb a raging pandemic. And also right-wing activists who wave weapons from pickup trucks in Portland, Oregon, seeking to intimidate Black Lives Matter protesters who were protesting police violence against African Americans. These activists on the left who protesting police violence represent the most important civil rights activism since the late 60s protests against racial injustice and the Vietnam War. Now, Joe Biden doesn't style himself as the head of a movement, and Black Lives Matter activists do not wear Biden-Harris hats, but the former vice president's campaign and the Democratic Party have been significantly influenced by all this remarkable activity in the streets. In fact, the 2020 Democratic platform is probably the most progressive Democratic platform in the party's history. Now, taking account of all this action, we have a twofold task. First, we want to place current developments in some kind of historical perspective. How does current activism relate to activism in the past? And second, we will discuss how the movement society, as some scholars call it, is affecting the Democratic and Republican parties, as well as the 2020 election. Now, we're fortunate to have two fantastic individuals to tackle these important topics, Sid Tarrrow and Megan Ming Francis, two of my favorite people. It's good, really good to see you guys. Sid Tarrrow is the Maxwell M. Upson Professor Emeritus in the Government Department at Cornell University. And Sid is an iconic scholar of social movements. He's written a lot of classic works on social activism, including the highly influential Power in Movement, Social Movements and Contentious Politics, which was published in its third edition in 2011. And Sid is now completing another seminal volume on social movements and political parties, which sheds light on the deep historical roots of contemporary developments in social movement politics. Megan Ming Francis is an associate professor of political science at the University of Washington and a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Harvard Kennedy School. Megan is a newly risen star who has made important contributions to our understanding of the relationship between social movements, party politics, and government institutions. Now, as someone who's been struggling to understand the contentious, but sometimes constructive relationship between social movements and the White House, I particularly value Megan's award-winning book, Civil Rights and the Making of the Modern American State, which was published in 2015. So Sid and Megan, welcome. It's an honor to have you as part of this conversation. Before we get started, I want to encourage our audience to ask questions anytime during our discussion. Just use the Q&A function on the bottom of your screen. So I want to start with a general topic and ask how social movements have affected elections in the past. And as part of this topic, I know our audience would like to hear Sid and Megan talk about how current insurgency on the left and the right is similar and different from past uprisings. So Sid, I'll start with you and then we'll move to Megan to tackle this first topic.
Thanks a lot, Sid. And I was very glad to hear you describe Megan as a rising star. I hope that doesn't mean that I'm a falling star. But I've been around for a long time, and I have been studying party movement relations since the 1960s. And if I may, I'd like to show you my doctoral dissertation, which was about this subject in another country at another time, peasant communism in southern Italy. More recently, as Sid Milkis said, I've been studying party movement relations in the United States, and I'm trying to use my experience and the history that I've studied in order to understand the present. Let me begin by saying politics for me operates in two modes. First, articulating interests and identities, particularly within a democratic system, and second, bringing these together into electoral majorities, what political scientists call aggregating interests. While political scientists have usually assigned these two functions to two different kinds of political organization, they don't always map easily into separate organizations, particularly during periods I call critical junctures, periods in which power is up for grabs and social change is occurring rapidly, like the current situation. While some social movements are not oriented towards politics, what Sid Milkis and his collaborator Daniel Titchener call militant and marginal movements, when they are connected to politics, the connection is largely shaped through their relationship to parties. Sometimes movements advance policy agendas that are easily integrated into parties or institutions, for example, like the group Mothers Against Drunk Driving. But movements can also champion transformative changes, like the abolition of slavery in the 1850s, what Sid Milkis and Dan Titchener call formative movements. And they're also affected by the conditions of the parties themselves, whether they're vulnerable to outside influence or not, as the new Republican Party was in the 1850s with respect to abolitionism, and as the Democrats were in the 1960s when they were in search of new voting constituents. Whatever the situation of the party system, the impact of movement party relations is not limited to a particular election, which is why we need to look at what I call long movements. Over time, movements will seek rules changes that can influence their effect on the party system, such as expanding access to the vote for Black Southerners did in the 1960s. Perhaps more significantly, movement insurgencies can trigger what I call reactive sequences that generate durable forms of backlash, like the backlash against civil rights that turned white Southerners into the core constituency of the Republican Party in the 1970s and 1980s. What does this tell us about our current conjuncture? Let me point to four things that I hope will come up in the discussion. First, we're living in what Sid Milkis earlier called a social movement society, one in which the lines between movements and other actors are more blurred than they used to be. Second, we're also living in a society in which the major political parties have been hollowed out, to use the language of our colleagues Daniel Schlossman and Sam Rosenfeld. Third, this has made the parties more vulnerable than ever to the inroads and influences of the kind of formative movements that Milkis and Titchener saw in civil rights. And fourth, and perhaps most controversially, the most successful movement of the last half century in influencing a political party has been the New Right Christian conservative movement, which laid the foundation for a new social movement, the Trumpian movement, to capture the presidency and to challenge the norms of American democracy.
Can I ask just before we go to Megan, just one quick follow-up, and we can dig into this in great detail as we go on. But when you say there's a Trump movement, do you mean the Republican Party, in essence, has become a cult of personality, or does Trump represent something broader in tapping in to this kind of social movement society we're living in now?
Yeah, I think two things, Sid. The first is that Trump didn't really come out of nowhere. He's been building on the capture of the Republican Party by the New Right and the Christian conservatives. And he's been building on a certain change in the political debate in America, which has become not only more polarized, but more ruthless over the past 30 or 40 years. Secondly, I think Trump is an unusual situation. He's more like the Willy Loman of movie time fare rather than a politician. Trump has a charismatic relationship to his base, one that isn't based on any particular policy programs, but is based upon a kind of magnetism, like the magnetism that Mussolini had for his base in the early 1920s before he took over power in Italy. So I think we're dealing with a movement, but it's also a movement that's taken advantage of the hollowing out of the Republican Party to at least temporarily capture control of that party.
And by hollowing out, you mean the institutions of the party?
That's exactly what I mean. The party still exists, of course. It still elects people. There are still many millions of people who consider themselves Republicans, but between the elite inside the Beltway and the electorate, there is no longer a very strong institution that structures demands and aggregates interests.
Okay, thank you, Megan. Why don't you weigh in here?
Yeah, no. So first, just really deep appreciation to Sid Milkis and to Sid Tarrrow. You guys are like both on the side of me, at least in my Zoom screen right now, and the opportunity to be in conversation. Both of your work over time has influenced me a lot. And so I think this is the first time that I'm actually in conversation with either of you. So this is, to me, very exciting. And I wish we could do this in person. To your question here about how social movements affected elections, for those who don't know, I probably should say a little bit, kind of a tiny bit of background around my work. So most of my work is really focused on the Black freedom struggle and the early 20th century Black freedom struggle. And then obviously thinking about the connections to the movement in the 60s and 70s, and then so much over the last 3-4 months, thinking about the connections between early 20th century, mid 20th century, in the present. Obviously, what's weighing heavy on my mind right now is the upcoming election. Initially, I think when you asked this question, Sid, about kind of how social movements affected elections, and this is also a conversation that I feel like I've been having with a number of activists in activist circles, my initial answer is social movements don't necessarily affect the elections directly, but in terms of, I very much agree with Sid Tarrrow in terms of working with and influencing parties, seems to be the way that many social movements have had an influence. But specifically in terms of, if I focus again on my specialty, which is the Black freedom struggle, I see in terms of social movements having an impact, especially in the early 20th and mid 20th, and in the major ways of, one, shifting the public kind of the climate of acceptability and public opinion. And it's clear that especially in terms of Black activists and their allies, work and organizing very much shifted how people thought about the responsibility of the American political and legal systems to Black people and what they should actually do. It's also clear, especially in this current moment, the importance of social movements and shifting the salience of different issues. That to me is really key. I mean, I'm coming out of this spring and summer, and like so many people that I never even thought have no problems with saying systemic and institutional racism. I've always taught right, institutional racism in my courses, and oftentimes like students would like flinch at the term systemic racism or institutional racism. But now I feel like we're having a nationwide conversation around that, as well as a nationwide conversation around the criminal punishment system and policing. And it is clear that that shift is linked to the Black Lives Matter movement. But it's obviously not just that. Obviously in the 60s, it's around education, around voting rights, around workplace discrimination. So that to me has seemed to be kind of a key role that social movements play around elections and also in conjunction with parties. The two more things that I see very much in this moment, as well as in the 60s moment, is one, bringing more people into the electorate. And so one of the things that gives me hope in this moment in which I have no idea what is going on, is that the organizing around voter registration, especially in the South, especially in rural communities, has been, I think, for me, really exciting to see people who really weren't interested in politics before becoming interested in them, and that you see a lot of the work of social movements as part of this. An organization that I think is doing phenomenal work is Black Voters Matter, and organizing, especially in terms of the Black Belt in the South. The other aspect here that you see a lot in this moment, and a little bit in the 60s and a tiny bit in the early 20th century, is bringing more money in. And this is, again, kind of the tie with parties. And there was seemingly at least so much money, in part because people wanted to do something, and part of the way in which they did something was to provide donations and contributions to organizations that could help bring about the goals of the movement in the contemporary case. To your last question, though, about how will social movements affect, I think, this election, I think for me, one of the things that I'm seeing that's a bit different than the 60s moment right here is there seems to be a very real question around reform or transformation. We can talk about this later as well, about that, especially around the Black freedom movement, that so much has been focused on reform, right? Reforming the political and legal institutions to make them more fair so they can include Black people. And it seems that one of a big call of the Black Lives Matter movement right now is a transformation call. That the systems, that the structures, that the Supreme Court doesn't work, that Congress doesn't work, that the executive lacks all types of legitimacy, and that the state is illegitimate, and that what we need are new systems and new people that are going to be in power. And so it strikes me that in this moment right now, and I know that some people have been calling this a possible third Reconstruction moment here, might be, at least I see kind of the Black Lives Matter movement trying to push us, or in this election, to think about what comes next in a Biden administration, and definitely in a Trump administration. What is the requirement and what comes next? And the last thing I'll say on this is that I trust that people who are tuned in to this webinar are familiar with your work, Sid Milkis, with Dan Tishner, and you guys, an incredible book, Rivalry and Reform, which I am assigning to my graduate class in American Political Development this fall, talk about the gestation period in terms of civil rights change and the impact and kind of and like the long process. And I think that's also really key for a lot of people to understand. I had conversations with people in 2015 and 2017 who were like, Megan, do you really think the Black Lives Matter is a group? Is this a movement? Does it really matter? Are they even successful? What type of change do they actually really want? And the kind of my pushback was always like, significant civil rights change, at least in terms of the lessons that we have coming out of the civil rights movement, as it takes a long time right? That part of what happens in terms of what happens over a number of years is developing the political skills, developing a type of political language, organizing and figuring out how to bring these different groups and different cities and towns together. And so I think a lot of times people get taken up and get like wrapped up in a movement moment and forget about the longer gestation period of these movements.
Yeah, you've written a lot about the anti-lynching movement, which suggests this arc, this battle against violence against African Americans has a long history, and is an important, has been animating civil rights activists since the kind of the birth of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, so the earlier work, I don't think you know this part, Sid, so I'll just say this. I did not know how to do archival work before I started my dissertation. Like that's not advice I give to any of my graduate students that I now work with. But so I was interested in the NAACP, and I did not realize when I started my dissertation work back in 2005 that the NAACP began in 1909. And because I didn't know how to do archival work when I began, I just started reading. And what like obviously unfolded for me was a story about the NAACP and their campaign around lynching, around mob violence and lynchings and that African Americans endured, and their belief, right, that focusing on ending white vigilante and state violence was the first civil right, that you had to focus on this before you could actually appreciate everything else that we now associate with civil rights, such as voting, education, workplace discrimination, etc. And so the NAACP launches this massive campaign around racial violence and the anti-lynching struggle in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, focused on Congress, right? Focused on shifting public opinion, focused on the Supreme Court, and of course, focused on the executive. And an administration that we would never believe that Black folks would be interested in contending with, which is the Wilson administration, right? And like the NAACP, for whatever reason, they had the audacity to believe that they could convince Woodrow Wilson, one, to meet with them and to make a statement condemning lynching, and that would actually do something. And what's also interesting that I think a lot of people look over, perhaps as they rightfully should, is before, in terms of the lead up to his election, is that he actually tried to make appeals to Black people that he would be the president for them. That obviously was not the case. But the NAACP, of course, did meet with him in his second term in office in the White House, right? And so the NAACP launches this massive campaign around lynching. And this is really, I think, in terms of like a foundational civil rights struggle, and in so many ways, kind of the prehistory of the Black Lives Matter movement. And also, I mean, there's a ton of lessons. I'm not going to spend that much more time on this, but I think there's so many lessons about the inability of us as a public, and especially our political institutions, to confront the complicity of government in the death of Black people in this country. Right, that it's not just something that like just arose with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, right? That this has been this has persisted. It has been a pattern across American political history that Black people have focused on. So I will end there.
Yeah, I always found it pretty fascinating, Megan, that the civil rights movement, the nascent civil rights movement, got Wilson to do something he didn't want to do, and that is to publish a major speech against lynching during the World War I, which was really kind of a remarkable accomplishment for the time by the civil rights movement. So Sid, let me bring you back in here, because one of the things you mentioned as a response to social movements trying to advance racial justice and other progressive causes is there tends to be a reaction to them. The civil rights movement has not had much effect, it seems, on President Trump, although there was attention to their causes at the convention. But for the most part, he's doubled down on a cause that has been important to the Republican Party since the late 60s, that is law and order. And Sid, I wondered how you think this struggle between rights, civil rights and law and order seems to be very central to this campaign. And Sid, I wonder how you think this is going to play out over the next couple of months.
Yes, I wish I was more of an expert on American electoral politics than I am, Sid, but I think there is a historic parallel, and one that Trump is probably carefully looking at, and that is the parallel between the current situation and the late 1960s. That was a period when Richard Nixon was running for president, 1968, and he successfully was able to exploit the fear of white Northerners in particular about Black violence. Much of this fear was very exaggerated and manufactured, but nevertheless, there was enough reality in the riots in the mid-60s for Nixon to be able to run on a law and order platform. And I think Trump, who is not a student of history, probably knows enough about history, or at least is surrounded by people who do, that he's been tempted to use that approach. But there's a big difference. And this goes back to something that Megan was saying. The big difference today is that there is consciousness in the public, and including the white public, that the police are not a neutral actor who are simply defending the public against violence. This is something new. It's not that the police were faultless in the 1960s, but that was not generally known. And the degree of focus on police violence was much, much weaker than it is today. So that makes Trump's task of running on a law and order platform more difficult than it was for Nixon. But there's a second factor, and it's one that should trouble us all, and that is, I say in my work that there's a great deal of attention needed for movement-counter-movement interaction. In fact, David Meyer and I, in our last book, described the movement against Trump as a counter-movement. Well, the counter-movement today that I think is most dangerous is the anti-Black power movement. Throughout the country, spontaneously, but also goaded on by right-wing websites and blogs, there is a violent anti-Black movement that has been developing in places like Portland, but in other parts of the country as well. It's not generally known that the amount of white power terrorism began to grow astronomically after Trump's election. The number of hate crimes, not only against African Americans, but against Muslims, Jews, and others, began to grow after Trump's election. This is not to say that Trump was responsible in a personal way, but because he appeared to give legitimacy to white nationalist, racist, and neo-Nazi groups. Those groups have been stirred to even greater action and greater violence by the Black Lives Matter movement. And we are beginning to see a pattern that began in Charlottesville in 2017 of white nationalists driving their cars into protesters in favor of Black rights. That's a new form of social movement performance that we haven't seen before. And it's one that has begun to be picked up around the country by people who claim to be supporters of Donald Trump, but whose politics go way off the screen on the extreme right. So I think Megan is correct that we now have a shift in the policy focus in which Americans are having to come to grips with police abuse and with generally the lack of racial justice in this country. but many Americans who come to grips with it are coming to grips with it in an extremely antagonist way. And we're seeing a real counter movement threatening to grow up around the country, everywhere where there are Black Lives Matters protests going on.
Megan, how do you think this conflict, counter movement conflict is going to play out? What's your thought?
I was just over here nodding my head. I think Sid laid it out so well. I actually would like to read. Now I want to know if he's working on a book project about this counter movement mobilization in this present period, because I do think that's something really important that people haven't spent enough time focusing on. I do think in terms of one of the things for me that has been so surprising, which I've been kind of thinking a bit about in the recesses of my mind since the end of May, is around now the lack of legitimacy of the police within like large portions of the American public. Not all, but like I never actually thought in my lifetime that as many white people that would kind of be in the space in terms of questioning the legitimacy of the police. I've had students, right, in terms of my courses, especially white students, come to me when I teach a course on civil liberties and constitutional law, come to me and ask me, we're reading these cases. These are fascinating plaintiffs. I'm also listening to my Black classmates, and they are talking about their distrust with the police and or their encounters with the police. And I don't understand, because I like the police. The police have always been a form and an idea. There's always been kind of, my idea of policing has always been around safety, right? But like now I think at a scale that I never thought possible, that narrative is shifted. And there's more tension around that narrative. And in so many ways, I think, and especially for Trump, that there's been kind of this like dependence and this kind of crutch on policing in terms of his legitimacy as a president. This is some of the work that I think Theta has actually been doing around early on in his administration around police unions. And his focus on policing. And yet still, I feel like it took this moment in the summer for a significant population of the American public to ask, I think, really important questions about policing that have really only been asked in communities of color. And I think that shift is really fascinating, as well as this counter, what did Sid Tarrrow said, the counter movement mobilization is something that we have to pay a lot more attention to, especially moving forwards in this election.
Sid, I wanted to just move back for a moment to your notion of the Republican Party as a movement party. What could you just explain for our audience what you mean by that, and how that speaks to the Republican Party as one that is, we touched on this before, it's not simply the Trump party, but something broader than that.
Yeah. Let's see, how can I answer this without sounding like an academic, which I am. I think some of the most interesting work, I don't do survey research myself, but I read it carefully. And one of the most interesting studies of the past 4 or 5 years is a study by Grossman and I'm blocking on the second author's name. It'll come to me, about the asymmetric nature of the two-party system, and in which these authors ask a number of questions about what's important to voters. And it turns out that there's radical differences, not only between left and right, that's pretty obvious, but between the degree to which voters and politicians are driven by ideology of any kind. The Democrats are a party based on group interests. They are a coalition of different interest groups. The Republicans, ever since the Barry Goldwater campaign of 1964, have been increasingly a party driven by ideology. And if you look at the successive incursions of different movements into the Republican Party. These incursions are not driven by group interests, they're driven by ideological conviction. First, the New Right in the 1970s, and then the Christian conservatives, and then finally the Reagan administration. These were ideological groups, and over the decades, most recently with the incursion of the Tea Party into the Republican Party, that party has become a party driven by ideology. So in that sense, it doesn't depend on Trump. In fact, as far as ideology is concerned, Trump is one of the least ideologically coherent politicians we've seen in a long time. He's not a maker of ideas. He is a maker of his own charisma. But the Republican Party is driven by ideology, and that ideology is more or less off the charts in terms of American political traditions. We are a polarized country, but our polarization is asymmetric. The Democrats have not changed that much because it's very difficult to get a party of group interests to change fundamentally. And I was interested in what you said earlier about the progressive platform of the Democrats. But the Republicans have gone off the map ideologically with a very strong hard right ideology. And that ideology has two main parts. One is white nationalism, and the other part, which we haven't talked about at all yet, is the ideology of deregulation, the small state, and libertarianism. And here, the people who are most important are not the white nationalists, but are the so-called Koch network, the network of very wealthy, very influential business groups, which have been enormously influential in driving the Republican Party to the right. Does that make it a movement party? No, because what it lacked until recently has been a magnetic political figure who could draw upon the ideological convictions of ordinary Republican voters and who could represent them, who could provide a focal point for those ideological strivings.
Thank you. So Megan, I wonder if you feel, before we go to questions, I just wanted to get you to comment on one thing, additional thing. I wonder if you feel that the surge of the Black Lives Matter movement and other social movements have, at least, if they have not made the Democratic Party a movement party, if they have moved the party to the left. I've been particularly intrigued by the primaries, some of the House primaries, and the victories of many people from the progressive wing of the party over establishment figures in the Democratic Party. So, what are your thoughts about the direction of the Democratic Party and the social movement activity on the left?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the most exciting aspects about the Black Lives Matter movement has been in so many ways kind of the way that kind of protests in the streets has also moved inside of political institutions, and a number of organizers who were actually connected with the Black Lives Matter movement were running for office, and some of them are actually now in office. I don't, it's right now because our big tent parties in the United States are so big, right? That it's hard even for me to be like, what is actually the Democrat Party right now? Now, obviously at the national level, I have an idea what the Democrat Party is. It's clear to me also that the Black Lives Matter movement has pushed the kind of the mainstream national Democrat Party more to the left. It was clear, at least in terms of at the beginning of the primary season, that kind of the national party treated kind of the left portion or the left progressive wing of the party as a nuisance. It has been to me really fascinating to look at the Biden administration, the list of possible kind of agenda policy proposals. I think you are right in the sense that it is one of the most progressive that we have seen in a modern presidency, like in terms of the Democrat Party. And I think that you only get that because of a very vibrant, organized left part of the party who wants a different type of party. I think there's this, and I'm going to misquote here, AOC in an interview kind of was asked about, I think, her support of Biden. And she's like, in a different country where there's more parties than two major parties, we wouldn't be part of the same party. But we are here in the United States. So yes, we are part of the same party. Yes, I support the Biden and Harris for president, for vice president of this country. It also is clear to me, even in saying Biden Harris, I don't think we would have got a Harris VP nod without the movement as well, right? I think it would have been Amy Klobuchar or Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan. And like in that VP slot, it has been very clear, especially coming out of the protests of the summer, that the Black Lives Matter movement and at least some of the demands are important for at least the Democrat Party for Biden to actually contend with. Now, I have no idea, knock on wood, that Biden wins this election, which is clearly going to be drawn out, right? We are all anticipating that. I'm not sure how he is going to be president. I am hopeful that some of the policy proposals and demands from the left wing of the party will be part of how he actually runs his administration. But it is also going to be clear to me that there will be a fight over the future and the vision of the Democrat Party should he win, between kind of a more mainstream Democrats as well as a kind of a more left progressive wings of the Democrat. I also do think that part of right now, part of that possible tussle, as well as the shift in the party, is somewhat connected to something that Sid Tarrrow mentioned, which is about, he mentioned the Koch kind of funding network, but I'm also always thinking about the role of philanthropy and funders and donors, and the role of funders in movement activism and the shape of that. So I'm happy to also chat more about that in the Q&A.
Yeah, we have a question here from John Smith that asks about the possibilities for the Democrats beyond the presidential election. And he says, given our current debacle, I mean the kind of constitutional challenge going on right now regarding what's going on in the Senate and the White House and the House of Representatives, what are the chances, assuming a Biden down ballot win, that changes can be implemented to prevent a recurrence of similar problems that we're facing now? Is there a chance? You talked about institutional changes being in play in a way that may be different from the past. Do you see some constitutional changes coming out of this election? Maybe a court packing plan or something like that?
This for me?
Yeah, that's for you. I'm sorry.
That's tough.
Well, Sid, I welcome Sid to respond.
Yeah, I'm curious also about Sid as well as the other Sid too. I think that it's tough. I mean, one of the things that's clear coming out of this is that Democrats need to rethink enforcement mechanisms. And so I think the right, especially in the Trump administration and before, has been really good at institution building and building power. I'm part of a number of conversations right now about how does the left build power? How can we think about building power, even if Trump is reelected, but especially under a Biden administration? What are the levers in which we can focus on building power? And it's clear that one of the ways that we need to think much more about is how do we institution build? So for example, the two biggest ones that I think are really interesting, ICE and the Department of Homeland Security. My students today, right, so think that these are institutions that have a lot of legitimacy and were always around. And these were institutions that were built. They emerged in my lifetime, right? And they are deep enforcement mechanisms that are used now, and that we just think of them as natural. And so for me, in terms of under a Biden administration, I think one of the possibilities for me is to think much more about how do we build new institutions that don't do the role in terms of enforcing caging of children, right? And enforcing a type of kind of religious discrimination, but how can we build new institutions that provide a different type of enforcement, right? And so thinking about the enforcement mechanisms in the landmark Civil Rights Bill of '64, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That's a different type of enforcement, right? In terms of providing resources and institutional teeth to prosecuting those who were found to be around voting violations and workplace discrimination. But like thinking about like, how do we build that into policy? How can we build new institutions that operate differently is something that I've been thinking a lot more about, because it's clear that so many of the gains that we have fought decades for have been quickly erased. And so how do we build institutions and policy in which it's going to be like harder to tear it down?
What do you think, Sid? Any thoughts on this?
I had two thoughts. One may be slightly different than Megan's. My first response is, constitutionally, I think the current situation with the court is guaranteed to lower the importance of the court over the long run. I think that the fact that the court has become so thoroughly politicized is going to delegitimize the importance of the court, which has varied over the decades. Whether or not there'll be an effort to pack the court if the Democrats come to power, I couldn't possibly say, but I'm struck by the fact that respect for the court is declining, and it has been declining for a while, ever since the Citizens United decision of 2010. My second point, and this is where I may want to have a conversation with Megan afterwards, is that although my own politics are well to the left of Joe Biden, my feeling is that the Democrats would be well advised to tamp down the growth of the left if they come to power. And the reason for that is not that I believe inherently in more moderate goals, but because I think the task for the American party system after Biden's election, if there is one, will be to recover the Republican Party for democracy. I think the Republican Party has begun to come to the realization that it's off the map, that its election base is off the map, that its demographic base is slowly but surely disappearing, not disappearing, but becoming narrower and narrower, more and more white, more and more male, more and more elderly. And the Republican Party is going to have a conversation about this. What will help to recover the Republican Party for a democratic dialogue is if Biden is able to resist extreme demands from the left and to try and govern in a way that could bring back a certain degree of bipartisanship that was lost when Obama was elected and when the Republicans set off with the goal of destroying him politically.
Sid, your point about the court suggests how deeply the country is polarized. And we have a question here from Winston Tang, who points, it's a long, complicated question that I don't have time to read, but it points to a lot of the factors that you pointed to and as contributing to the rise of a movement society, and suggesting that social movement activity and other features of our political system, like this unfiltered social media, have made the polarization so deep that the divisions are almost intractable, and recovering the Republican Party or stopping the move of the Democratic Party towards the left may be very, very difficult. So I wonder how you and Megan think the social movement politics of 2020 have contributed or been affected by polarization, and how that might play out in the election and afterwards. Do you want to go first with that, Megan? Talk a little bit about social movements and polarization.
Let Sid Tarrrow take that one first.
You
if that's okay.
You want Sid to take the lead?
Yeah.
I can be brief because I'll just throw the question back at Sid Milkis and remind him and his fans that the type of social movement that has been most effective in the past, and I think in the present, is what he and Titchener call a formative movement. And that is a movement that can operate simultaneously inside of and outside of institutions. The best historical example we have of this was the anti-slavery movement, which was at one and the same time a faction within the Republican Party, that is an insider group, and a movement outside the party, the abolitionist group. That was a very effective hybrid of insider and outsider tactics. And I think that's has to be the answer for any successful social movement today. It has to be one that can operate at both of these levels. And in order to operate at both of these levels, it is going to have to build coalitions. And we see that, I think, hopefully, in the current situation of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has both been expanding its demographic base. Just look in the streets. You look at the color of the people in the streets. It's the first time in American history that we're finding multiracial participation in a majority Black movement. It is moving in that direction in its racial and ethnic composition, and it's moving in that direction in expanding its policy agenda. So 3 cheers for Black Lives Matter. I hope that it continues to act like a formative movement.
What is it? Do you think it has the potential to be a formative movement, Megan?
Yeah, I in so many ways, I think I would have 2 years ago, my response to Sid Tarrrow would have been, why does it have to, why do activists have to work with inside, like, let's say the Democrat Party or a political party? I think that I would have perhaps maybe taken issue with that. But what I've seen right over the last, especially 2 years, and this year in particular, has been something that also, because there were so many critiques for institutional politics, traditional so-called traditional politics, and a deep distress of this political system, right? Like what activists wanted and what I think many of them still want is revolution and transformation. But what I've seen I am somebody who focuses on this and still am surprised is that so many of these activists and organizers are actually trying to work and to shift the party and change the party, right? And that, like, unlike I feel like in 2016, but in 2020, there's more like get out the vote efforts. Let's figure out how do we like work with people inside of the Democrat Party? How might we run for office and change the system from within? And in terms of not thinking that these tools or these institutions will save us per se, but thinking of these as tools that can help us, that are available to us as organizers and activists who have a more transformative vision of what is possible, and that can help us push the door open a little bit more. And so that has been, I mean, the work with inside, what I kind of might consider as formal party politics and formal institutions, has been fascinating to me in this moment. And part of that, I think, in terms of what has opened up career political elites and institutions, is the work that is happening, as Sid Tarrrow says, on the ground, in towns and in cities, right? That, like, what you see is this shift of people who are Black and brown and also white, who seemingly want something that's different. And so I think that kind of the shift in the climate of acceptability has also been really important to political elites and institutions being more receptive to organizers and activists.
Do you think the multiracial dimension of the current Black Lives Matter movement that Sid pointed to, and what you said earlier about the incursion into areas, rural areas, like Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, do you think that sort of allows Black, or suggests that the Black Lives Matter movement might be, as Sid suggests, an important contributor to a kind of coalition politics, just the very different dimensions of the social movement itself?
Yeah, no, it's been fascinating. I I think initially the first week in June, when we heard whispers around like white communities organizing marches for Black Lives Matter, and I was like, "What? Huh? Why?" Right? But I do see, in terms of kind of the multiracial movement that has definitely happened in the spring and summer, as opening, I think, a different set of possibilities, and it's also clear, I think, in terms of like these demonstrations in these small towns, oftentimes with the marches that are actually not predominantly Black, that are oftentimes predominantly white, kind of provide a glimpse that there might be another set of politics is actually possible. I think also there's been a number of, I think, sociologists who have actually focused on, especially these protests in rural areas. And one of the things that they are, at least that's coming out, is that a lot of the shift, especially amongst people in rural communities, is happening amongst young people. And that young people in what have been kind of perceived to be Republican strongholds, is that there is, I don't know if it's an awakening and a reckoning, but a kind of a shift in understanding around race, especially. So I think that's been interesting, and I'm not yet sure kind of what are the future possibilities of that shift, and also in terms of how to sustain that. I think that's the other big question here, right? The question about is this a moment that happened, and how do we continue that energy from the spring and summer into the fall and into the next year? I'm not yet sure, but I think it's exciting.
So there's a question that I'd like to take on the last few minutes we have here. Causes us to shift gears a little bit, but we haven't talked about the pandemic. And we have a question here from Arthur Bernstein, which is quite interesting. He says, it seems that during this worldwide health crisis, wearing a mask or not wearing a mask has become a social movement in itself. How did something as simple as a piece of health equipment take on such significance? Sid, do you want to talk a little bit about that, or how you think the pandemic relates to the current social movement politics?
Well, I can give a short answer and a long answer. The short answer is that there are an awful lot of Republican idiots who think that wearing a mask is somehow a statement of weakness, lack of masculinity, support for liberal causes, collectivism, socialism. That's the short answer. A slightly longer answer is that, as you know, Sid Milkis, we are so deeply polarized that every aspect of life is structured by partisan identification. And this is a puzzle because, as I said earlier, the parties themselves are hollowed out. It's not that party organizations are mobilizing people into competing silos. That has happened in part because of the way the political elite has been divided, but also because of the way the country has developed. It has developed over the past, I would say, 30 or 40 years in a way that increases inequality, that increasingly isolates people into separate residential and cultural sectors, and which does not expose them personally to people unlike themselves. We know from the literature by social psychologists, for example, with respect to gay people, that personal exposure reduces the amount of discrimination and prejudice against gay people. Well, the same thing is true on a larger level. To the degree to which people are living either in gated communities, and that is largely true of wealthy people, or living in ghettos of people of color, and that is largely true for poorer people, to the extent to which these physical divides destroy solidarity, then we can expect increasingly that people will no longer think of themselves primarily as Americans, but as Democrats or Republicans.
Megan, we have about a minute left.
I'm sorry I talked so much.
No. We love listening to you. Megan, do you want to make some final comments on on this issue of the pandemic and Black Lives Matter, or anything you want to say in the last?
I don't think we actually would have got the spring and summer protests without pandemic. I think it's been, I puzzled both Sids for about a week about the difference in response and like why this time. Because the thing that always was surprising for me is that Black Lives Matter movement didn't just emerge in 2020. The police didn't just start killing Black people in 2020, right? And so why are these protests so much different than previous protests? And to me, it really, I mean, one of the things that's interesting here is the role of the pandemic. I think one of the things that we know about racism, especially American racism, is that people oftentimes try not to actually confront it, right? And so you're like, there's racism. Racism is actually a thing, but like it's difficult and complicated. And so I'm gonna ignore that this happens. I'm gonna go on a vacation. I'm gonna watch the opera, go to dinner, hang out with friends. And right, what happened in the pandemic is you couldn't do that anymore. Right? You could, all these escapism like features that we use, we couldn't do that. And so what we had is our families at home, our social media and our TV, and many people were like, oh my gosh. And because of pandemic, they were already primed, right? By like, pandemic is something that we all experienced, all of us. And what also we knew, especially in the United States, is that, whoa, Black and Indigenous and Latinx people, they get it a lot because there's deep structural health disparities in this country, right? And so people understood that like there's some type of structural inequality that led some people to die of COVID more than others, right? And so at least there was some understanding of like structural inequality. And then, the protest happened in which people were like, oh my gosh, now I'm inside, there's structural inequality, pandemic. And I just think what was interesting is that pandemic layered on top of everyday American racism, created, I think, kind of a groundswell on one end. Also in terms of protesters, it's clear it was pandemic in terms of the structural health inequalities that emerged from pandemic was just kind of another layer on already many different layers of inequality that especially Black people in this country experience. So I think that it heightened the need to protest and as well as opened up many people to have discussions with colleagues, with friends, with neighbors that they perhaps never did before.
Well, we're out of time. I could talk to you guys all day. It's been such fun having you. And by the questions that have come in from our audience, they wish we had more time as well. I'm sorry we couldn't get to more of them. So thank you so much. Thank you to our audience. And of course, thanks to my wonderful colleagues and talented colleagues at the Miller Center who've made this possible. So I hope we can continue this conversation soon. Bye-bye.
All right, this has been great. Bye.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Bye, Sid.
Bye, Megan.